Buried beneath these marble tombstones in the hills of Montana are clues to one of the most notorious chapters in the history of the American West. Here, over a century ago, two cultures collided. Before the smoke cleared, a legend was born. Today, archaeologists have unearthed a dramatic new account of the battle, one which echoes long-ignored Indian renderings of the bloodshed. What really happened to Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn?
I'm John Rhys-Davies. Join me as we explore the myth of Custer's last stand. Next on Archaeology.
They were the bravest of the brave, 210 men of the 7th US Cavalry. At the head of their column was the flamboyant George Armstrong Custer. Blue-eyed and golden-haired, fearless and defiant, he was a paragon of valor. His adversary was an Oglala Sioux named Sitting Bull, whose disdain for whites and hatred of reservation life was well known. The two men's destinies crossed on a ridge above the Little Bighorn River. Here Custer and the 7th Cavalry would make a gallant stand. It would be their last. In a blaze of final glory, Custer and men fell one by one. But how much of that myth is true?
For the first time, we're able to plot the final agonizing moments of that bloody day on the ridge above Little Bighorn. Scouring the battlefield for bullets, buttons, fragments of bones, archaeologists have generated a unique computer simulation of the day's deadly crossfire, belying the long-held myth of Custer's last stand.
"200 miles southeast of the Little Bighorn battlefield, the Black Hills rise above the Great Plains. It is here that the story of Custer's last stand begins. To the Sioux, the Black Hills were the center of the world. They were willing to fight for it at all costs. America was moving west. In the lead was the United States Army. The Sioux and the Northern Cheyenne struck back. They attacked wagon and supply trains moving through the region. In 1868, a peace treaty was signed. It promised the Indians control of the Black Hills forever. But the promise would soon be broken. Gold had been discovered, and miners spilled onto Sioux sacred land. Thousands of Indians refused to accept the invasion and roamed in the unceded lands of Montana and Wyoming. The United States government issued an order to the Indians to return to their reservations by January the 31st, 1876. January rolled by, and they had not complied with the order. 3 army columns were dispatched to the northern plains to round up the Sioux and return them to the reservation. In one column was the 7th Cavalry under General George Armstrong Custer. A hero of the Civil War, Custer was a bundle of contradictions. Hungry for success, he would fall victim to a succession of errors in judgment. One fatal mistake would be to attack Sitting Bull. The Sioux spiritual leader had a vision in which he saw soldiers on horseback coming down like grasshoppers, falling into camp. Dead soldiers. Sitting Bull summoned the Sioux and the Cheyenne to Rosebud Creek near the Little Bighorn River, and they came by the thousands. On the 25th of June, Custer attacked. What happened next is a legend of frontier history. But until recently, the full story has remained untold. In 1983, fate handed archaeologists a unique opportunity. A prairie fire had swept across the battle site, fully exposing it for the first time in nearly 100 years. Doug Scott, working with the National Park Service, and Richard Fox co-directed an excavation of the battlefield which included the innovative use of metal detectors.
We essentially lined up with a group of people, what might be called a skirmish line, and just marched across the battlefield.
The archaeologists unearthed more than 9,000 artifacts and remains. Each find was a silent reminder of bloodshed in anger more than a century ago.
Here at this particular marker is probably one of the most poignant artifacts that we ever found. It was single finger joint with a ring similar to this one still around the individual's finger. It represents some of the 30 widows and orphans left behind, not to mention the men killed.
Just beneath the battlefield's scorched surface, the metal detectors signaled hundreds of bullets and spent cartridge cases. For the first time in more than 100 years, archaeologists were now able to reconstruct the Battle of the Little Bighorn. That reconstruction would show the deadly crossfire Custer's men had faced in the last moments of battle. It would also answer the old question, did Custer ever fight a heroic last stand? The Battle of the Little Bighorn has long been one of America's most studied conflicts, yet much remains speculation and myth.
The Custer myth really starts here. It's a very venerable myth, started virtually as the gun smoke wafted from the field. Custer came down Medicine Tail Coulee to the ford intending to attack the village, which laid across the Little Bighorn River, and he was met by hordes of Indians and driven away from the river, driven to the north up to Custer Ridge. And there, he and his men organized a gallant but futile defense and essentially went out in a blaze of glory to the last bullet and the last man, and very often the last man was Custer himself.
The excavations at Little Bighorn have turned that myth on its head. Archaeology revealed that while the army had fought with Springfield carbines and Colt revolvers, the Indians fielded as many as 41 different types of gun. Each spent bullet and cartridge still carried unique ballistic markings from being fired. By tracking these forensic fingerprints with the help of a computer, the archaeologists saw the long, still battlefield once again come to life.
When we moved into the firearms identification process, the study of the individual firing pin imprints, and by seeing the clustering of the end-in cartridge cases, we were able to see new and unknown end-in positions. And combining that with the accuracy of the computerized mapping, we could actually trace individuals moving across that field. By understanding that there were movements of people, and certainly the weapons in those people's hands, we could begin to see the dynamics of that battle take place.
Now, the new thinking is, in fact, here in Medicine Tail Coulee, Custer did come down to the mouth. And in fact, the Indian village was across the river. But he didn't attack, and he was not met by hordes of Indians. And what we learn is that he found a virtually empty village.
And why? Earlier, Custer had ordered his second-in-command, Major Reno, to attack the Indians in the valley. Reno's assault drew the warriors away from the village, forcing the women and children to flee.
Custer Ridge. Custer had come up on the ridge in pursuit of the women and children who were fleeing out of the village. In fact, he came up on the ridge, left the right wing in a position here, and he took his left wing down to the river again, but had to come back and wait. So the entire Custer command waited on Custer Ridge.
Custer was waiting for reinforcements from his subordinate, Captain Benteen, whom he had ordered to scout the river valley earlier in the day. But Benteen was aiding the beleaguered Reno. Custer's men waited in vain.
As they waited, more and more Indians accumulated, crossing the river and coming up into this area, infiltrating and pot-shotting at the soldiers. And finally, this accumulation became so great that Captain Kehoe sent Company C down into this area to relieve the threat.
Within minutes, the Indians launched a counterattack, led by lame white man, a Cheyenne. Company C collapsed and fled towards Calhoun Hill.
Calhoun Hill is the only place where we find archaeological evidence for tactical stability, particularly in the cartridge case evidence. We see the cartridge cases lined up in what we could consider to be a skirmish line, men kneeling and firing at 5-yard intervals along a skirmish line.
This tactical stability, however, was not to last. It would be the beginning of the end. Custer's men were swept away by a tidal wave of warriors, led by the Hunkpapa Sioux Gall and by the legendary warrior Crazy Horse. Gall had lost 2 wives and 3 children to Reno's earlier surprise attack on the village. In vengeful fury, Gall forded the Bighorn. He threw himself at the doomed men on Calhoun Hill. Crazy Horse joined the attack. Together, they drove the soldiers to Custer Hill and surrounded them. In desperation, some soldiers attempted to flee towards the river, but were trapped in a deep ravine.
Finally, the Indians overwhelmed Last Stand Hill and killed the last few remaining soldiers there, poured over the top, down toward the river, and into the deep ravine area where the last men were killed.
The battle was finally over. It had taken less than an hour and a half.
So we find, actually, in the myth of the last stand, there was in fact no last stand. But it was a desperate struggle with confusion, chaos, and panic and terror, just as most battles are. In fact, in most decisive battles, the end comes through psychological debilitation.
To flesh out the scenario suggested by the archaeology, Fox turned to a long-ignored source, the historical accounts and paintings of the battle done by native warriors themselves. They indeed verify the outlines sketched by the new archaeological data.
The Indian accounts use metaphor for panic and terror. They acted like they were drunk. They fired wildly in every way. They acted as if they were crazy. They played dead, and many other types of metaphors. We find that the soldiers did not fire their weapons very often, and in some places not at all. And the Indian accounts, many of the Indian accounts confirm this, and some of them even say they threw their weapons away, which again is indicative of the terror going on at the time. And in fact, in many instances, the Indian bullets correspond with the memorial markers on the battlefield, indicating that, yes, soldiers did die there, but not in a fighting mode. By tracing Indian accounts to those positions, we hear stories of men running and generally trying to find safety and hide. But I do want to point out that this is not cowardice. And these men entered battle, and they were brave. But when the psychological effects of terror overcome you, it makes you helpless. Instead of the gallant, heroic last stand, we see the human aspect of fear and panic, the psychological factor.
Something that is always focused on in the telling of this story is the mistakes of the military. Everything that they did wrong.
Owing to the archaeological work of the last decade and to an appreciation of the only historical accounts of the battle, much has changed at this site. Perhaps the most significant is the appointment of superintendent.
And it would be equally as important and interesting to do a presentation on what the Indians did right. Because obviously there were some things that were done right that day. There was a strategy in the way that we knew military.
Barbara Booher, of Ute and Cherokee origin, is a minority of one in the National Park Service.
There are 359 units in the park system right now. And of those, there are 36 women superintendents. And of those 36 women, I'm the only American Indian. That's why I feel lonesome sometimes.
The battlefield archaeology now reveals that Custer's men were outgunned, outmanned, and outfought that day.
The firepower of the Indians' firearms has been drastically underestimated, I think, by most historians. It was significant. And we're estimating, 700, 800 guns at least, and outnumbered 7 to 1. With that much firepower, you don't have much of a chance. And we found, I think it was 9 different bullets embedded around this marker, indicating that there had been many Indians firing at this single individual. I can't imagine being that individual at that point, trying to reload my weapon or fire back, and bullets coming from all directions. He clearly died there.
Not only did the Indians have more guns, but it was now clear their weapons were superior for the bloody, close-in fighting that had raged.
The Army firearms were not substandard. They were excellent, but they were single-loading, the carbines were. So I had to fire a shot, reload, and then fire again. And at least with the repeating rifles that the Indians had, they were able to fire anywhere from 7 to 16 shots without having to stop and reload. So I think the amount of firepower, if not the knockdown power, played a major role in the battle in the defeat of Custer's command.
Ultimately, the story told by the bullets and the cartridge cases unearthed at the Little Bighorn was not just of a single battle, but an epic drama of 2 cultures locked in historic conflict. And even in the details, there is a certain irony.
The cartridges the Indians were using, these 44 caliber, these small 44 calibers, were manufactured in Hartford, Connecticut. Yet the Army cartridge cases, these large ones, were manufactured at Springfield, Massachusetts, just up the road. What we have are cultures in conflict using weapons that were generated by the same culture.
The soldiers were fighting for what they believed in, Western expansion and white settlement. But so too were the Sioux and the Cheyenne fighting for their way of life, preservation of the open range and buffalo hunting, an existence they had known for centuries. In the long run, the Indians won this battle, but lost the war. Within a short 8 months, most Sioux and Cheyenne would be back on the reservation, and Sitting Bull, the last of the Indian leaders considered hostile, had been forced to surrender.
The Indian perspective has never been presented as much as the non-Indian perspective. The accounts of the battle were written by the non-Indians and told by the non-Indians. And I think there have been a lot of misconceptions because Indians are inherently quiet people. We're not a people that documents and writes. All of our histories are oral. And in the past, I think it was easier for the public to deal with us after we're dead.
Kitty Bell Deernose, a Crow Indian who grew up here, now is museum curator. She oversees the care of some 24,000 artifacts and over 2,000 photographs of 7th Cavalry and Indian leaders of the period.
In our collection, we have about 150 photographs of George Armstrong Custer, and from what I understand, Custer was a man who liked to be photographed and made sure that he was well photographed. I'm becoming very familiar with the man.
In 1991, Congress changed the name of the site from the Custer Battlefield to the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument.
I was happy. I was happy about the name change because my grandfather is buried in this national cemetery. He was an Indian scout here, and my great-grandmother, Kitty Deernose, is buried with him. And so this is my home, and I feel that the name should really reflect the geography of this area rather than somebody like Custer, who was here less than a week's time.
This battlefield was once a shrine to the American military and a symbol of white dominance over Native Americans. Today, a new monument is planned to honor the Indian warriors who fell at the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
It is a measure of how much the American historical consensus has altered that such a commemoration can take place, and a testimony to a willingness to confront the archaeological truth about the past.
These guys that were here at the Little Bighorn were more than just pictures in books, and sometimes I can even visualize them out on the battlefield in the heat of that day in their military woolen clothing and having just ridden 20 miles to this battlefield, and the terror and the fear and the heat and the exhaustion. I feel sympathy for them in the heat of that Sunday afternoon in June.